Usually when you're trying to understand like a massive catastrophic failure, say, I don't know, a bridge collapsing or something.
Right, or a patient flatlining on the table.
Yeah, exactly. A patient flatlining. You expect to find a really clear linear chain of events,
Yeah.
like a specific rivet sheared off or a specific artery was blocked. It's a clean diagnostic process.
Absolutely. It's A leads to B leads to C.
Right. But the moment you step into the realm of historical analysis, especially when you're looking at massive social and political upheavals that basically rewrite human civilization,
Yeah.
that diagnostic clarity just completely
Oh,
vanishes.
it goes right out the window.
It really does. You're suddenly navigating this incredibly murky landscape of converging forces and unintended consequences and just all these wild paradoxes.
It's messy.
Really messy. And today we are taking a deep dive into the absolute murkiest, most highly debated, and honestly, arguably the most fascinating diagnostic landscape in modern history, the French Revolution.
It really is the ultimate historical knot, isn't it?
Oh, totally.
Every time you think you've untangled a single thread, say, the financial crisis or maybe the intellectual awakening of the period,
Right.
you realize it's just inextricably pulled tight by half a dozen other geopolitical, social, and psychological factors.
And untangling that knot is exactly our mission today. We are taking a massive mountain of historiographical notes on this, and we're mapping it directly onto the previous year, questions the PYQs for the UPSC Civil Services Mains History Optional Paper.
Which is such a crucial exercise for anyone preparing for this exam.
It's mandatory, honestly. Because, look, if you're listening to this, you're the dedicated learner, you're the UPSC aspirant, and we aren't just reciting a timeline of when the Bastille fell or like when the guillotine was built.
No, the examiners don't care about just the dates.
Exactly. We are decoding the mechanics of history to understand the why and the how. How does a wealthy, populous nation completely implode? Why did the rest of Europe just, sit back and watch it happen?
Right.
And we're going to explore this profoundly important concept. The idea that with the outbreak of this revolution, European history essentially narrowed its focus until it merged into the story of one nation, one event, and eventually one man.
The nation being France, the event being the revolution.
And the man being Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah. And that framing is so crucial for anyone preparing to analyze this era for the exam. I mean, for a period of about 25 years, the entire destiny of the European continent was being violently funneled through the streets of Paris.
Wow, yeah.
And the aftershocks of what happened in those specific streets completely dictated the political evolution of the modern world.
It's wild to think about. So we have this massive, complex puzzle. Let's start with the geopolitical reality of the late 18th century, because there's a really common line of inquiry from the examiners. I mean, most recently we saw this in the 2020 PYQ.
Right, the one about structural factors.
Exactly. The prompt was, the causes of the French Revolution of 1789 included both long-term and structural factors, as well as more immediate events. It demands that we really understand the environment surrounding the powder keg.
Which is step one in any good analysis. You have to look at the neighborhood.
Right. Because if France was experiencing this massive, catastrophic structural failure in 1789, a glaring question emerges. Why didn't the neighboring absolute monarchies, Austria, Prussia, Spain, why didn't they just march their armies across the border?
It seems like the obvious move, doesn't it?
Totally. Just march in, crush the peasant uprisings, put the French king back in total control, and stop these dangerous anti-royalist ideas from spreading to their own kingdoms.
It's a brilliant question. And to answer it, you basically have to completely discard the idea that Europe was this unified club of monarchs who were always ready to defend one another.
Oh, so they weren't all just allied against the commoners.
Not at all. You have to paint a picture of a continent that was deeply divided, financially strained, and utterly distracted by its own imperial ambitions. I mean, the prevailing system of the old regime in Europe was absolutism. Control was fiercely held by a tiny aristocratic elite, pretty much everywhere.
Right. Even in constitutional England, the vast majority of the population had no franchise, no voice at all.
Exactly. But the political health of these regimes across Europe, it was rotting from the inside.
Yeah, the governments in Central Europe at this time are generally described by historians as hopelessly decadent. The administrative machinery was just so slow, corrupt, and largely inefficient.
Very true.
But the real key to answering why they failed to intervene in France, it actually lies further east, doesn't it?
It does.
It lies with Russia.
Specifically, it lies with the relentless territorial aggression of Catherine the Great.
Okay, break that down for us because this geopolitical distraction is so important.
So, Russia, under Catherine II, was pushing this incredibly aggressive policy of expansion. She had her eyes firmly fixed on dismantling and absorbing massive territories belonging to two very specific neighbors,
Which were?
the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Okay.
And this geopolitical maneuvering created a massive continent-wide distraction.
Okay, let's drill down into the mechanism of that distraction, because this is where that structural factor from the 2020 PYQ really solidifies. How exactly does Catherine the Great wanting a piece of Poland stop an Austrian army from marching on Paris?
It all comes down to the balance of power and, honestly, paranoia.
Paranoia, I love that.
It's true. Think about it. Austria and Prussia were the two major military powers sitting right on France's doorstep.
Right.
They were the ones who logically should have been the most terrified by the collapse of the French monarchy, but they shared borders with Poland.
Oh.
Yeah. If Russia moved into Poland and swallowed it whole, Russia would suddenly become this overwhelming existential threat right on the borders of Prussia and Austria.
Wow. Okay, so they're trapped.
Completely. Therefore, Austria and Prussia could not afford to send their massive armies west to deal with, French rioters. They had to keep their armies marshaled in the east to ensure that when Catherine carved up Poland, they got their own slices.
Just to maintain that balance of power.
Exactly. They couldn't let Russia get too big.
That is the ultimate geopolitical standoff. So they're so busy watching each other with daggers drawn over this Polish buffet that they completely ignore the house catching fire in the west.
That's a great way to put it. There's actually substantial historical evidence suggesting that Catherine the Great actively encouraged Austria and Prussia to intervene in France.
Wait, really? She wanted them to fight France?
Yes, she played on their royalist sympathies precisely because she wanted their armies bogged down in a Western European quagmire.
Oh, that is so sneaky.
Right, because that would give her a completely free hand to dominate the East. And because Austria and Prussia were essentially paralyzed by this Eastern paranoia, they just couldn't take joint decisive action against France until the revolution was already deeply entrenched.
Until the king was already compromised and the revolutionary armies had begun to form.
Exactly. They missed their window.
And honestly, the rest of the European board was in no condition to step in either. I mean, you look at Spain, they had long since lost their former military prestige and economic power.
Yeah, Spain was not a threat at that point.
And Italy wasn't even a nation. It was simply a geographical expression, just a patchwork quilt of petty states, republics, and foreign-controlled territories without any internal cohesion.
And then, of course, you have England.
Ah, right.
England had just endured a massive, humiliating, and incredibly expensive defeat in the successful revolt of its American colonies.
Right, they just lost America.
Exactly. Under the administration of Pitt the Younger, England was desperately trying to recover its economic strength at home and its diplomatic prestige abroad. They were basically in a period of necessary isolationism.
I mean, it makes sense. Launching a massive continental war to save the French absolute monarchy, a monarchy that had, ironically, just spent a fortune helping the Americans defeat the British.
Oh, the irony is thick.
It's absolutely out of the question for England.
Completely off the table.
Okay, so we've clearly established this geopolitical vacuum. On no side of France were there barriers strong enough or armies available enough to resist the rising tide of revolutionary sentiment. That perfectly covers the external structural factors for that PYQ.
Right.
But we really need to pivot to the internal structural decay, because here is the great historical anomaly that you always have to grapple with. Peasants were suffering all over Europe.
Yes, they were.
I mean, serfdom in Russia and parts of Germany was arguably far more brutal than anything happening in France. Yet the structural decay reached a terminal explosive breaking point only in France. Why is that?
This is the absolute crux of understanding the domestic powder keg. To understand why France broke while the others just bent, we have to examine the specific evolution, or actually the mutation of the feudal system within French borders.
Mutation. Okay, I like that word.
Yeah, because in other European countries, feudalism was brutal, sure, but it was still fundamentally a reciprocal system. The feudal lords enjoyed massive privileges, primarily exemptions from taxation, but they still performed the corresponding feudal duties.
Right, they had a job.
Exactly. They served as the officer class in the military. They provided local governance. And crucially, they were responsible for maintaining law and order, roads, and local administration out of their own pockets.
So it was a deeply unequal system, obviously, but the aristocracy still fundamentally had a job to do. They functioned as the localized state machinery.
But in France, that system had been completely hollowed out over the previous centuries, largely by absolute monarchs like Louis XIV, who wanted to centralize all power in themselves.
The Sun King taking it all.
Right, so the French feudal lords had been systematically stripped of their actual administrative, judicial, and military powers. The king's intendants ran the provinces now.
Okay.
However, to keep the nobility placated, the crown allowed them to retain all their financial and social privileges.
Oh, wow. So they kept the tax exemptions.
Kept the tax exemptions, the exclusive hunting rights, the monopolies on the local mills and wine presses, and the right to extract traditional manorial dues from the peasantry.
So the mechanism of resentment here is profound. A French peasant is looking at the local lord and realizing, you don't govern this province anymore, the king's intendant does. You don't protect us from bandits. You don't fund the local infrastructure. You literally do absolutely nothing but extract wealth from my labor.
Exactly. It transforms the aristocracy from a governing class into a purely parasitic class. And a privilege without a corresponding societal service is fundamentally intolerable.
Intolerable is the perfect word. And this resentment was fiercely compounded by the internal fractures within the nobility itself, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. When we examine the long-term structural factors, we have to look at the tale of two nobilities, the nobility of the sword and the nobility of the robe.
Yes. Understanding the friction between these two groups and their collective friction with the crown and the commoners is essential for any high-level historical analysis on the exam. Let's dissect the nobility of the sword first.
Okay.
These are the ancient, old-blood aristocrats. They trace their lineage back centuries to medieval knights and feudal warlords. But by the late 18th century, their actual political power was in steep decline. And surprisingly, many of them were financially destitute.
Yeah, historiography often refers to the lowest tier of this provincial aristocracy as the hobereaux, or the little falcons.
The little falcons. It's a brilliantly descriptive term.
It really is. Because they were predators. But they were small, desperate predators. They were being crushed by rising inflation and a changing agricultural economy. And because they were of noble birth, it was socially completely unacceptable for them to engage in commerce, trade, or manual labor.
Right. They couldn't just go get a job.
No, they couldn't earn new wealth. Furthermore, they couldn't afford the ruinously expensive lifestyle required to live at the royal court in Versailles, which was literally the only place to secure lucrative royal pensions.
So they were just trapped in their crumbling provincial chateau.
Trapped and broke.
So how did these little falcons survive? Because they had to eat.
They survived by ruthlessly, aggressively turning the screws on the peasantry. They hired lawyers to dig through centuries-old medieval charters to find forgotten, obscure feudal dues and tolls that they could suddenly enforce.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they charged peasants for crossing a bridge, for using a specific road, for gathering firewood in the forest, just nickel and diming them to death.
Honestly, they sound like broke aristocrats aggressively charging peasants a toll to cross a bridge just to keep up appearances.
That's actually a great way to put it. And this aggressive revival of feudal extraction directly paved the way for the violence of the revolution.
Yeah, that's so.
Because when the peasants eventually rose up, they didn't just burn the chateau randomly. Their primary targets were the terriers, the record rooms holding those ancient documents. They systematically destroyed the legal instruments of their own economic oppression.
That is so strategic. Now, contrast these desperate old blood little falcons with the other side of the aristocratic coin, the nobility of the robe.
Right.
This is where the structural rot of the French state really becomes apparent. The nobility of the robe were not ancient warriors. They were wealthy individuals whose aristocratic rank came entirely from holding specific, powerful judicial or administrative posts within the government.
Yes.
And the mechanism of how they got those posts is just mind-blowing. They didn't earn them, they bought them.
Yes. The system known as the venality of office. It's crucial to understand.
Yeah, explain how that worked, because it sounds crazy to a modern ear.
Well, for centuries, whenever the French monarchy needed a quick injection of cash to fight a war or build a palace, they simply invented new government positions, new judgeships, new administrative titles, and they sold them to the highest bidder among the wealthy middle class.
Wow.
And over time, in exchange for an annual fee, the crown actually made these purchased offices hereditary.
So the nobility of the robe is basically like wealthy people buying a lifetime hereditary seat on the Supreme Court.
That is a very accurate comparison, actually.
Oh, wait, I'm stuck here. I need to understand the mechanics of this. We are talking about an absolute monarchy. The king supposedly has total, unquestioned authority derived directly from God.
Theoretically, yes.
So if the country is facing a massive financial crisis, which they were hovering on the brink of total bankruptcy, why doesn't the king just point his royal muskets at these wealthy tax-exempt nobles, especially the judges he technically outranks, and simply decree a new tax? Why let a bunch of bureaucrats paralyze the nation?
That goes right to the heart of the limits of 18th century absolutism. The king's power was theoretically absolute, like you said, but practically it was bound by centuries of tradition, legal frameworks, and the physical reality of governance.
Okay, so he couldn't just do whatever he wanted.
Right. These nobles of the robe controlled the parliaments. Now, these were not representative legislative bodies like the British Parliament. They were powerful regional appellate courts.
Got it.
And the most powerful one was the Parliament of Paris. By tradition, before any royal edict, including a new tax, could become the law of the land, it had to be officially registered by the Parliament.
Wait, so these wealthy individuals essentially bought a hereditary veto power over the king's finances?
In practice, yes. If the king tried to pass a law taxing the nobility, the nobles of the robe in the Parliament would issue a remonstrance, which was a formal refusal to register the law, claiming it violated the fundamental laws of the kingdom.
That is insane. Could the king override them?
He could technically force the registration by holding a special, highly formalized royal session called a lit de justice. But doing so was incredibly unpopular, politically costly, and it often resulted in the judges simply going on strike.
A judicial strike.
Exactly, which paralyzed the entire justice system. The monarchy had literally sold off pieces of its own sovereign power for quick cash, and by 1787, it could not govern its own country.
That perfectly answers the great paradox of the pre-revolutionary French economy. I mean, when you look at the macroeconomic data of the late 1780s, the sources say France had 28 million people and was economically capable. How are they structurally failing? They were one of the most economically capable nations in Europe. They had a booming foreign trade, lucrative colonial possessions in the Caribbean pouring in sugar and coffee wealth. The nation itself was remarkably rich, but the government was completely hopelessly broke.
And that is what turns a manageable financial deficit into a catastrophic, systemic structural crisis.
Yeah.
The country was rich, but the state treasury was empty.
Because of the wars.
Yes, due to decades of global warfare, including their massive financial support for the American Revolution, which was funded almost entirely on high-interest debt, combined with their archaic, inefficient tax farming system. The crown desperately needed to reform its finances and tap into the wealth of the nation.
But they couldn't?
No. Every time a royal finance minister proposed a rational land tax that would apply to everyone, the nobility of the robe and the parliaments blocked it. They absolutely refused to surrender their tax-exempt status.
So by stubbornly protecting their own wealth and paralyzing the government, the aristocracy effectively forced the collapse of the state. This turns a financial crisis into a structural political crisis.
Precisely.
Now, to round out the structural picture, we have to look at the geographical mechanism, the Paris factor, because France was uniquely centralized compared to the rest of the continent.
Administrative centralization is a vital component of the structural argument here. In places like Germany or Italy, power was decentralized among hundreds of principalities and city-states. Even in England, provincial life and local governance remained robust.
Right.
If a massive riot broke out in a German city, it didn't necessarily topple the whole regime. But in France, centuries of absolutist policy had drawn all political, administrative, and cultural life entirely into Paris and nearby Versailles.
All the roads lead to Paris. All the decisions are made in Paris.
Exactly. The provinces had been completely stripped of their autonomy. Consequently, Paris became the absolute nerve center of the nation.
So it created a situation where the demographic and political weight of one city could dictate the fate of 28 million people.
Yes. Administrative centralization meant whoever controlled Paris controlled France. Unrest in the provinces didn't matter as much, but Paris was the heart. When the structural decay reached its breaking point, and the revolutionary forces, the mobs, the intellectuals, the radicalized middle class gained mastery over the streets of Paris, the entire country essentially fell into their hands by default.
Okay, so synthesizing this for the structural argument for that PYQ.
Yeah.
We have a geopolitical environment where foreign intervention is impossible due to the Polish distraction.
Sure.
We have a domestic anomaly where a wealthy nation is governed by a bankrupt state.
Right.
We have a parasitic aristocracy clinging to privilege while abandoning duty, and a governance structure paralyzed by the venality of office. The wood is stacked, it's soaked in kerosene, and it is waiting.
It's just waiting.
But a powder keg, no matter how volatile, does not spontaneously combust. Something has to provide the spark, and something has to provide the ideological framework that tells the people what to do once the explosion happens. Which brings us to segment 2, the spark versus the tinder, and the most heavily, relentlessly debated question in the entire syllabus, the role of the Enlightenment intellectuals.
The historiographical debate regarding the philosophers. Did they cause it or just inspire it? Did the books cause the bloodshed, or did the bloodshed simply borrow the vocabulary of the books?
Examiners love to harp on this. I mean, just look at the PYQs surrounding this. We're tackling a massive cluster here. 1983, 1985, 1997, 2002, 2007, 2012, 2016, and 2023. They have framed it a dozen different ways over the last 40 years.
They really have.
They ask if the writings of the philosophers form the intellectual creed of the revolution. They ask if the whole revolutionary situation is what actually mattered, making men revolutionary almost in spite of themselves, while the philosophers played no important role.
And they repeatedly ask if monarchical misrule ignited the fire, while lofty ideas inspired and sustained it. You absolutely cannot tackle this period without a masterful grip on exactly what the intellectual climate was, and more importantly, how it actually translated into political action.
So let's bring in the heavy hitters. To dismantle this, we have to first outline the mechanisms of the ideas themselves. What was actually circulating in the salons and coffee houses of Paris?
Well, you have the foundational work of figures like Montesquieu. In his massive study, The Spirit of Law, published mid-century, he didn't just critique the government, he systematically exposed the fallacies underlying the entire theory of the divine right of kings.
Right.
He analyzed the mechanics of absolute power and advocated forcefully for the separation of powers, dividing the executive, legislative, and judicial functions to prevent tyranny.
And then you have the broader, almost subterranean cultural movements, right? Like the rapid spread of Freemasonry throughout France. The Masonic lodges functioned as a shadow network of intellectual exchange, spreading deeply radical concepts for an absolutist, strictly Catholic society.
Concepts like liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Yes. And it is no historical accident that those precise Masonic ideals became the official, blood-soaked slogan of the revolution itself.
Absolutely not an accident. And we must recognize that these ideas were not forming in an isolated French vacuum. There were two massive external engines driving the intellectual awakening: the English influence and the American influence.
Let's talk about the English stream first.
Okay, so the English influence was deeply rooted in the empiricism of the previous century. The French thinkers were devouring John Locke's treatises on the consent of the governed and the natural, inalienable rights of man.
And Voltaire, right?
Yes. Voltaire, after spending time in exile in England, basically weaponized his admiration for the British parliamentary system. He used the English model of constitutional limits and religious tolerance as a mirror to brutally reflect and denounce the rigid censorship, religious persecution, and absolute privilege that defined the French system.
But the American influence was perhaps the most psychologically profound, wasn't it? Because it shifted these ideas from abstract salon philosophy into tangible gunpowder reality.
Oh, without a doubt. And this directly addresses the 1999 PYQ about the American War of Independence inspiring the French.
Oh, right. Because the American War of Independence didn't just inspire the French with lofty pamphlets. It provided a live fire demonstration that Enlightenment ideas regarding the separation of powers and popular sovereignty could actually be implemented to build a functioning state.
It wasn't just a distant rumor. Thousands of French soldiers, including really high-ranking aristocrats like the Marquis de Lafayette, had actually crossed the Atlantic to fight alongside the Americans as anti-British mercenaries.
And the physical return of those soldiers was an intellectual contagion. They came back to France saturated with Republican enthusiasm and democratic ideals. They had seen the theories of Locke and Montesquieu practically applied in the forests of Virginia and the halls of Philadelphia. They knew a different world was physically possible.
So true.
So we have a society awash in radical, subversive ideas. The easy, almost dangerously lazy historical conclusion is a straight line. Montesquieu writes a book, the people read the book, the people realize the king is a tyrant, the people overthrow the king.
But the historiography demands a massive reality check on this direct causation theory. We have to look at the remote and indirect argument.
Yes, let's do the reality check, because this thesis is vital for a nuanced historical argument. A direct attribution of the revolution's outbreak solely to the philosophers represents a fundamental misunderstanding of 18th century society.
First, we just have to look at the demographics of dissemination. Who was actually reading Voltaire and Rousseau?
Not the peasants.
No. Books and pamphlets were prohibitively expensive.
Yeah.
The literacy rate among the peasantry, the people who would eventually storm the chateau, was incredibly low. The primary audience for Enlightenment literature consisted of wealthy bourgeoisie, progressive nobles, local dignitaries, and, ironically, the absolute monarchs themselves.
Which is the greatest paradox of the Enlightenment. You have Frederick the Great of Prussia, one of the most ruthless, efficient, absolute monarchs in European history, enthusiastically corresponding with Voltaire and hosting him at his court.
Exactly. If the absolute monarchs are sponsoring the philosophy itself clearly isn't a magic spell that instantly triggers a violent revolution against absolutism.
Right. Plus, the philosophers themselves didn't preach violent revolution, did they?
Not at all. They were intellectuals, reformers, and honestly, often elitists. They largely believed in enlightened despotism, the idea that reform should come from a rational, educated monarch at the top, not from a violent mob at the bottom. They would have been absolutely horrified by the chaotic, bloody reality of the Reign of Terror.
Okay, I think the best way to understand their role is to look at modern parallels. Can we view the philosophers essentially as modern tech disruptors?
Oh, yeah.
So to answer the 2007 PYQ, no event occurs in an intellectual vacuum. We can say the philosophers didn't light the match, but they poured gasoline on the wood. Imagine a modern tech disruptor or an investigative journalist who writes a massive, viral expose pointing out that a legacy institution, say the traditional banking system or the modern healthcare industry, is fundamentally obsolete, corrupt, and running on buggy, archaic code.
Okay, I'm following.
The disruptor doesn't physically hand out pitchforks and tell people to burn down the bank, but by exposing the bugs and flaws so articulately, they fundamentally destroy the public's respect for that institution. They point out the system is buggy and obsolete, which makes the public lose respect for it, the church, the nobility.
That is an exceptionally strong analytical framework. The philosopher's function is the ultimate solvent of traditional authority. By relentlessly, brilliantly criticizing the bedrock institutions of the old regime, the Catholic Church, the bloated aristocracy, the inefficiency of the royal bureaucracy, they systematically eroded the prestige and the unquestioned mystique of those institutions.
They stripped away the aura of divine sanction. They proved the system wasn't ordained by God. It was just a broken machine built by flawed men.
Right. So what mattered was the revolutionary situation, the empty treasury, the bad economy, the Third Estate's grievances. As the 1985 PYQ suggests, men were made revolutionary in spite of themselves by their conditions.
So when the bread ran out, the people felt zero moral obligation to respect the crown.
Exactly. The intellectual groundwork for systemic disrespect had already been laid.
And we also have to look at how the Enlightenment was weaponized after the fact, right?
Yes, the philosophical doctrines were frequently utilized during the chaotic course of the revolution to justify extreme political violence that the original authors never intended.
Like Robespierre.
The most glaring example, Maximilien Robespierre's terrifying manipulation of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of the general will. Rousseau envisioned a social contract where the community's collective interest guided the state. Robespierre warped that concept to insist that he alone understood the general will, and therefore anyone who disagreed with him was an enemy of the people.
Wow.
He used the language of Enlightenment philosophy to construct the intellectual justification for the guillotine, executing moderates, aristocrats, and fellow revolutionaries alike in the name of abstract logic.
Which perfectly ties this to the 1997 and 2002 PYQs. The prompt asks, if monarchical misrule ignited the French Revolution, lofty ideas both inspired and sustained it.
And that is the perfect synthesis. Did monarchical misrule ignite the fire while lofty ideas sustained it? Yes.
The misrule and economy were the spark and the tinder.
The misrule, the paralyzing structural debt, the arrogance of the tax-exempt nobility, and the literal starvation in the streets of Paris that was the explosive spark that drove hungry, desperate people into violent action.
But once the Bastille fell and the old regime started collapsing into ash, what were they going to build on the ruins? The peasants didn't have a blueprint for a new constitution.
The philosophers provided the ideological vocabulary, the structural blueprints, and the legal frameworks for the new society once the old one burned down. Misrule provided the destructive energy, Philosophy provided the constructive direction.
Okay, so we understand the structural powder keg, and we understand the philosophical solvent that weakened the container. Now we have to analyze the actual explosion. Segment 3, A Tale of Four Revolutions.
Debating the nature of the uprising.
Because this is where the historiography gets incredibly layered. We are not looking at a single unified revolution. We are looking at a chaotic collision of competing interests. We need to unpack the 2015 PYQ on multiple contradictions and address a really fascinating 2025 PYQ. The French Revolution started and led to victory in its first phase by the aristocracy.
To navigate this, we have to explore the different historical lenses through which historians view the true nature of the uprising. And we need to ensure an impartial analysis of these viewpoints.
Right. So what are the main schools of thought here?
Well, the scholarship offers several distinct, often conflicting views that an analyst must synthesize. For instance, the traditional Marxist historiography frames it strictly as a social revolution.
Okay, view 1.
Through this lens, a rising, wealthy, dynamic capitalist middle class, the bourgeoisie, violently overthrew a stagnant, dying, feudal ruling class. The revolution is seen fundamentally as the inevitable triumph of capitalism over feudalism.
But other historical schools push back hard on that narrative, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. The revisionist view, that let's call it view 3, argues that framing it as a strict class war is entirely inaccurate, because feudalism as an economic system was already practically dead in France, and the bourgeoisie in 1789 was not yet a cohesive, unified class with a singular class consciousness.
So what do they call it then?
This view frames the event as a purely political revolution with massive social consequences. It was a power struggle among various elites, both noble and common, vying for control of the state apparatus as the absolute monarchy imploded under the weight of its financial crisis.
And there's another perspective too, right? The Atlantic Revolution framing.
Yes, view 7. The Atlantic history perspective frames the French Revolution not as an isolated national anomaly, but as the central, most explosive chapter in a larger transatlantic wave of democratic uprisings. This wave began with the American Revolution, swept through France, sparked the massive slave revolt in Haiti, and inspired radical movements in the Netherlands and Ireland.
It was a global crisis of the late 18th century imperial model. Those are all vital frameworks. But to truly map the internal contradictions and understand the bizarre sequence of events from 1787 to 1789, we have to utilize the four revolutions concept.
This is the key to unlocking the highest marks on the exam. It gives you the granular mechanics of the upheaval. Let's start with the first phase, which directly answers the 2025 PYQ, the aristocratic revolution from 1787 to 1789.
Okay, let's unpack this because it seems like a complete historical oxymoron. Why would the most privileged class in society launch a revolution against the system that protects them? The nobles started it.
It does sound deeply counterintuitive, but the timeline is undeniable. The first fatal blows to the absolute monarchy were struck by the highest nobles in the land.
Let's trace the mechanism of this aristocratic rebellion. It all comes back to the imminent bankruptcy of the state, right? Financial experts like Turgot and Necker begged for tax reform.
Exactly. The king's treasury was empty. Successive royal finance ministers all analyzed the ledgers and came to the exact same inescapable conclusion. The state could not survive by squeezing more taxes out of the impoverished peasantry.
So what did they propose?
The only mathematical way to avoid catastrophic national bankruptcy was to implement a universal land tax that applied to everyone, including the nobility and the clergy.
And obviously the nobility refused.
Well, Calonne, one of the finance ministers, realizes he can't get this tax past the Parliament of Paris because the nobles of the robe will instantly veto it. So in 1787, he tries an end run. He advises the king to convene an assembly of notables, a hand-picked group of the highest-ranking princes, dukes, and archbishops in the country.
Hoping they'll just volunteer to pay.
Basically. Calonne hopes that if he lays bare the horrifying reality of the state's finances, these great nobles will act out of patriotism, agree to surrender their tax exemptions voluntarily, and force the parliaments to comply.
And I'm guessing that gamble failed completely.
Spectacularly. The Assembly of Notables looked at the ledgers, saw the financial ruin, and absolutely refused to surrender a single privilege. Instead, they blamed the financial crisis on the incompetence and extravagance of the crown. They essentially went on a political strike.
Wow.
By refusing to pay a dime to save the state, and by utilizing their control of the judicial courts to block every royal decree, the aristocracy essentially rebelled against the absolute monarchy first to protect their wealth. They actively paralyzed the absolute monarchy.
Historians often call this aristocratic revolution the curtain raiser to the main event. It is a breathtaking irony. The aristocracy, in a blind, greedy attempt to protect their own wealth and claw back political power from the king, deliberately triggered the collapse of the central government. They triggered their own demise by refusing to pay a little tax.
Entirely unaware that they were opening the floodgates for their own utter destruction. By breaking the authority of the king, they proved the system could be broken.
Okay, so that's Revolution 1. What happens next?
Because the government was paralyzed and bankrupt, the king was forced into a corner. In a desperate bid to bypass the rebellious nobility and secure new taxes, Louis XVI made the fatal decision to convene the Estates General in May 1789. This was a medieval representative body that hadn't been called in over 150 years.
And the moment the Estates General met, the aristocratic revolution was immediately swallowed whole by the second phase, the bourgeoisie revolution of 1789.
The middle class steps up.
Right. The Estates General was divided into three orders. The first estate, the clergy, the second estate, the nobility, and the third estate. Now, the third estate was everyone else, representing 98% of the population, but led primarily by educated, wealthy bourgeoisie lawyers, merchants, administrators.
And the third estate arrives at Versailles and realizes the nobility intends to manipulate the voting rules to keep them powerless.
Right, the voting by order versus voting by head issue.
Exactly. So the bourgeoisie lawyers launch a bloodless legal coup. They declare themselves the true National Assembly, representing the nation, and swear the famous Tennis Court oath, vowing not to disband until they have written a new constitution.
This was a profound political and legal revolution. A group of commoners arrogated sovereign power to themselves, effectively ending absolute monarchy on paper.
And this is a massive historical pivot point. Paper declarations don't stop musket balls.
No, they don't.
The bourgeoisie lawyers in Versailles had rhetoric, but the king still commanded the royal army. As Louis XVI began gathering thousands of foreign mercenary troops around Paris, it became glaringly obvious that he intended to crush this middle-class rebellion by force. The bourgeoisie revolution would have been a minor historical footnote if it hadn't been violently rescued by the Third and Fourth Revolutions.
The intervention of the masses. The popular, or sans-culottes revolution, and the peasant revolution. The commoners, shopkeepers, laborers, artisans. Let's look at the third phase first.
The sans-culottes, literally those without knee breeches, distinguishing them from the silk-wearing aristocracy and wealthy bourgeoisie, were the working poor of Paris. They didn't care about abstract constitutional theories or the separation of powers.
Yeah, they cared about food.
They cared about the fact that a catastrophic harvest, combined with the deregulation of the grain trade, had caused the price of bread to skyrocket. A working-class Parisian was suddenly spending up to 80% of their daily wages just to buy enough bread to keep their family from starving.
Hunger is the greatest radicalizing force in human history. When the sans-culottes saw the king gathering troops around Paris, they didn't just see a political threat to the National Assembly, they saw a physical threat to their own survival. They believed the king was preparing to starve and massacre the city. So on July 14th, 1789, they took action.
They stormed the Bastille.
Right. They needed gunpowder to defend themselves, so they attacked this massive royal fortress and prison in the heart of Paris. The violence was visceral. The governor of the fortress was decapitated, his head paraded on a pike.
This sheer, terrifying violence by the urban poor instantly shifted the balance of power. The king, terrified by the mob, ordered his troops to stand down. The violent intervention of the sans-culottes physically saved the bourgeoisie assembly from military destruction.
And we cannot discuss the popular revolution without deeply emphasizing the mechanism of female participation. Women led the march to Versailles to capture the king, and women led the soap riots over commodity prices.
Yes, in October 1789, thousands of working-class women, armed with pikes, pitchforks, and dragging cannons, marched 12 miles in the pouring rain from Paris to the royal palace at Versailles. Driven by famine and fury, they breached the palace gates, slaughtered the royal guards, and physically captured the king and queen.
They forced the royal family to pack their carriages and move to Paris. As the historiography notes, from that moment on, the absolute monarch of France was essentially a hostage in the hands of the people of Paris. The power dynamic was permanently shattered, not by lawyers, but by starving women.
And while the urban poor were capturing the king, the Fourth Revolution was exploding across the vast French countryside, the Peasant Revolution.
Right.
During the summer of 1789, a phenomenon known as the Great Fear swept through rural France. Rumors spread that the angry aristocrats were hiring bands of brigands to burn the peasants' crops and starve them into submission. Driven by this mass panic and centuries of built-up resentment, the peasants preemptively rose up in a massive, uncoordinated, nationwide agrarian revolt.
They attacked the chateau, burned the manorial records, and refused to pay any more feudal dues. They basically destroyed the feudal system from the ground up through sheer violent refusal to participate. Okay, let's unpack this. The revolution wasn't one unified team of the people against the king. It was actually 4 different classes playing hot potato with a collapsing state.
That is exactly right. It is a profound web of contradictions. You have 4 entirely distinct groups operating simultaneously, but with violently clashing objectives. The aristocracy wanted to cripple the king to maintain their feudal tax exemptions. The bourgeoisie wanted a constitutional government based on merit, but they desperately wanted to protect their own private property.
While the urban sans-culottes wanted radical price controls on food and the execution of hoarders' demands that terrified the free market bourgeoisie.
Right, and the peasants just wanted the feudal dues abolished and to be left alone on their land. You have property owners allied with property destroyers. Free market lawyers relying on the physical protection of mobs demanding socialist price controls.
So how did these multiple contradictions forge a single social revolution?
Because for one brief, explosive historical moment, all 4 groups found themselves united in a single common action: the total destruction of the old regime. They all hated the status quo, even if they violently disagreed on what the future should look like.
Wow. And in the end, when the dust settled, one group emerged as the victor. The French Revolution was the crucible that finalized a long economic and social evolution, destroying the power of the nobility and cementing the bourgeoisie as the dominant ruling class.
Which brings us perfectly to our final segment. Segment 4, Ideals versus Reality, Objectives, Achievements, and the English Contrast.
Right, addressing the PYQs on achievements 1979, 1989, 1996, 2003, 2014, and the contrast with the English Revolution. Let's start with privilege versus property, answering the 2003 PYQ. The French Revolution attacked privileges and not property.
This statement encapsulates the ultimate victory of the bourgeoisie, the middle class. When we look at the decrees of the historic night of August 4th, 1789, we see a systematic dismantling of the old world. Under the pressure of the violent peasant revolts, the liberal nobles and bourgeoisie lawyers formally abolished the feudal system.
They abolished the manorial dues, exclusive hunting rights, tithes to the church, and tax exemptions. They destroyed the guilds, they eliminated the venality of office, the legal foundation of a 1,000-year-old aristocratic society was swept away. Birthright privileges were annihilated.
But, and this answers the prompt, they attacked privilege, but they vehemently, fiercely protected private property. The bourgeoisie lawyers writing these laws were wealthy men. They owned land, businesses, government debt. They had no intention of allowing the state to redistribute wealth.
They didn't want a socialist utopia. They wanted a meritocracy where wealth and talent dictated power, not ancient bloodlines. They destroyed the privileges of the old aristocracy to safeguard the property of the new capitalist class, making themselves the dominant class globally.
Exactly. Now let's address the 2014 PYQ. The Declaration of Rights was the death warrant of the system of privilege, yet it belonged rather to the past than to the future.
The Assembly, imitating the Americans, declared all men free and equal. It swept away the old regime. But why did it belong to the past?
Because it was a philosophical manifesto against the old abuses, but it lacked the practical framework to govern the chaotic future of France. The men who wrote it were brilliant intellectuals, but they lacked practical experience in running a nation under crisis.
It had no plumbing schematics for the future, no mechanism for running an economy undergoing hyperinflation or fighting a multi-front war. And this failure of practical governance paved the road to the Reign of Terror and eventually Napoleon.
Which leads us to the English versus French contrast. The examiners frequently ask for this comparison. The English Revolution of 1689 was fundamentally political, defensive, and conservative.
They wanted to preserve ancient laws and rights without a violent break from the past, right?
Exactly. They created practical constitutional checks. They kept the monarchy, the aristocracy, the social hierarchy. The French Revolution, however, was social, destructive, and radical, intoxicated by new ideas, aiming to tear the system out root and branch. They aimed for the total reconstruction of every system based on the absolute sovereignty of the people.
Which brings up a fascinating psychological insight from the text. The French didn't actually care that much about political liberty. They were used to centralized despotism. What they hated was social inequality. So I have a question. Is that why they eventually embraced Napoleon? Because he gave them social equality even if he trampled all over their political liberty?
That is a brilliant connection and absolutely correct. After 10 years of chaos, the French people were exhausted by the pursuit of political liberty. Napoleon stripped away their political liberty, censored the press, rigged elections, crowned himself emperor.
But he codified the social equality.
Yes. The Napoleonic Code guaranteed equality before the law, protected private property, and ensured careers were strictly open to merit and talent. They traded political freedom for social order and meritocracy.
Incredible. So, if you are listening and preparing for the UPSC, you are now armed to tackle any question on this topic. You know that the philosophers provided the script, the economy built the stage, the aristocracy accidentally raised the curtain, and the bourgeoisie walked away with the box office profits.
A perfect summary. But we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. The French Revolution tried to replace the absolute sovereignty of a king with the absolute sovereignty of the people. But if the people are divided into 4 different classes with competing interests, aristocrats, bourgeoisie, peasants, and sans-culottes, who actually gets to decide what the general will is?
When you try to build a utopia from scratch, do you inevitably pave the way for an emperor?
Something to think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, keep hunting for the structural why beneath the surface, and best of luck in your preparation.